I'm going to stop the music there and say hello. If you're with me today on our masterclass about how to advance your internal comms career, just use your emojis and means I can know that you're there and I can get a little hello from you all, which is lovely. I'll introduce myself in a second, but first of all, just want to say thank you for joining me. Thank you to the team at Workvivo for hosting the masterclass. Now, I've been working with them throughout this year, actually. This is our third masterclass together. And we've been working together because we both believe that the world of work can be a much better place if you improve communication. So it's always nice to be with the team. And today we're going to talk about advancing your internal comms career. Now, as I go through the masterclass today, you'll have the option to ask questions. So please use the Q&A function and pop your questions in there. Feel free to use the chat as much as you like and chat away with anything you want to ask. James is with us in the background, so he can answer any questions and he'll be sharing links and different things as well. Now, as we get towards the end of the session, we'll go into Q&A. So I'll have probably about half an hour to answer any specific questions, which is my favourite bit. And you'll also get the chance to win copies of both of my books. One is Influential Internal Communication, and the other one is Nobody Believes You, How to Become a Leader People Will Follow. And you'll have the chance to win both of those by tagging both Workvivo and me in a LinkedIn post and telling us what your sort of big takeaway was from the session today. And then you'll go into a prize draw, which is always exciting this close to the festive season. So without further ado, I will get us started. So this is me. I'm Jenni Field. I am CEO of Redefining Communications. I am a speaker and an author. I've also got a couple of podcasts. I like to do a bit of research. So I've spent a lot of my career doing research into things like deskless and frontline workers, as well as line managers, as well as leadership credibility. I'm just very curious, so I like to know why things are happening. And I do a bit of work on leadership coaching, and outside of work, I like a bit of CrossFit, I do some yoga, and I also read a lot of books. So I guarantee you in this masterclass today, I will mention a few books that I recommend. If I do that, and if you want my list of reading, I'm very happy to share that. Just drop me a DM on LinkedIn if you'd like to get a copy of our reading list. Absolutely fine. But I read a lot, so I will definitely mention a few. So that's me. I've had a career in communications for about 20 years, which I'm going to go through in this session today. So what we're going to talk about is my journey from being a communication assistant to a communication director over about 10 years. And I'm just going to share with you how I've moved around into setting up my own business, which was never my intention. There was no grand plan, but I want to share with you that journey so you can see how it might look for you if you're looking at your career. We're going to chat a bit about networking and different ways of doing that. I've had a look at the questions that some of you submitted as well when you registered. So some of those I've pulled out and I'm going to answer those as part of the session before we go into the live Q&A. And I'm also going to talk a bit about deciding what to learn, sort of how to spend your time. I've got sort of 3 tips around that that will help you think about being intentional about some of that learning and development. So to kick us off, I'm going to talk about myself for the first 15 minutes and my journey that took about 10 years, really. And I said just now that there wasn't any big grand plan, right? So sometimes people will say to you, you know, I want to be a communications director, or I want to be this, or I want to be that. And these are the steps to get there. I didn't have that vision. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I just knew that when I finished my A-levels, and that's sort of finishing college, and I didn't do very well there, I couldn't get a job. So I had to go and do a degree because I couldn't get any work in PR and communications. I knew I wanted to do that, but nobody would take me on without a degree. I do think that is changing, but that has been an issue for our industry for a long time. So I went off and did a marketing degree. And I did that with a bit of Spanish on the side. Don't ask me to speak Spanish because it's a long time ago. But that's what I did as my degree. And then I got my first job as a communications assistant. And this was in the public sector. So I got this role, which was a very junior role, looking after, supporting communication in this particular sort of local council, sort of public sector space. And in that job, I was looking after the press office. So I deal with the press calls. I was writing the community magazine. I was dealing with internal communication around sort of redundancies and putting content together for that. It was a really junior role. So, and also in sense of time, it was quite some time ago. But I would do things like I'd have to cut out the clippings from the newspaper and stick them into a binder, and I'd have to measure them with a ruler to show how much space we'd got in the newspaper. So I was doing very junior tasks in that role, but it was such a good all-round role. So I often talk about starting quite broad if you're not really sure what you're doing. And if you've got a broad role, it means you're doing a variety of different things. And that means that you can find the things that you like and find the things that you don't like, or find the things that you're good at or that you're not so good at. And in this role, this was a fixed term contract. So I did this for about 18 months. And then I went off to be a media relations advisor in the defense industry. Now, I've put the industries on here because there's a lot of talk about moving industries and sometimes how difficult that is and how you can't do it. Now, I do know at the moment in the job market that people are looking for people that are sector specific. So people are looking for that. But you'll notice when you see my journey that I've dotted around all over the place. And that's really because I believe that people are people, regardless of where they are, and organizations are people. So if I understand communication, people, how we work, what we need, the industry or the sector shouldn't really matter, because it's about the people in that organization and what we're trying to achieve. The reason I became a media relations advisor was because I really enjoyed the press office. I really enjoyed that, the phone call and then the running around to find someone to comment. The fact I didn't know a lot of stuff, you know, people would ring and ask for a comment on elections or various other things, and I had no idea about what they were. So it was such a learning opportunity to sit with the person that headed up that function and ask all the questions that I felt I needed to know in order to help the press and the inquiry. And that's important to advance your career. So we have to be curious, we have to be asking questions, and we have to understand everything in order to communicate that somewhere else. Now, I loved this role as media relations advisor, and I did that for a couple of years, but it got quite formulaic for me. And I felt that I was just doing the same stuff for different trade shows or trade events. And I was talking more to trade journalists who are really experienced in the sector that they're writing about. And that knowledge gap for me was quite big. And it was clearly a gap that I didn't feel passionate enough to want to fill. So after a few years there, I felt that that formulaic nature to the role maybe would not suit me. So maybe I needed something that I felt I was having more of an impact. And that's where I came back to what were the things I really enjoyed as a communication assistant, and what could I maybe go back to doing that I felt gave me slightly more purpose or helped me feel more fulfilled. And I think that's a big part of navigating your career, is figuring out how to feel fulfilled in what you do. And that's linked to your values, it's linked to what you enjoy and all of those things. So this is where I became an internal communications officer in the advertising sector. Now, I will say at this point that these roles were all very local to me. So I live in a town in the south of England, and these were all roles in organizations that were about a 20-minute drive from where I lived. I was not going far. I was very happy in my little world, in my little area of the south of England. And I was happy to kind of just go into these different organizations. Now, this role was the first role that I had where I was setting up a function. There was no other officer in the organization. I've still got no idea why I was an officer. I can't tell you what that means because I don't think they did. So I was an internal communications officer and setting up the function. So I sat in marketing, but it was the first time they'd started to look at internal communications. And we had about 12 or 15 sales offices where we had different people out on the road selling advertising in a book. And this was a fascinating part of my career, because this was probably the part where I thought internal communications is what I really want to do. But it was also the first time that I had a phone call from somebody in the internal communication industry. Up until this point, I had no idea there was anything out there for people in communication. And there used to be a company called Melkroom, which doesn't exist anymore. And they used to do events and all sorts of things. And they rang me up about something. And it sort of opened my eyes to the fact there was other things out there. And I say this because I think that's one of the big things about looking at your career, is that external perspective. How much do you know about what's out there for you to help you with your career? And if you're leading a team, how much do your junior members of team know? So I was talking to a client this morning and we were saying that some of the people, there's 25 of them, I think, in the communication function dotted around, and a lot of them don't know about the things that exist out there. And that's really important because that's where you can get so much of that networking and that experience and support to help you with your career. So I was internal communications officer for a couple of years. You'll notice there's a trend here. Every couple of years, I tend to sort of move on. And I stayed there until I sort of felt like I wasn't really growing anymore. And I think that's the thing, again, it's knowing yourself. Like I didn't feel like I was really going anywhere. I couldn't see anywhere to go. I was an internal communications officer. I was doing a wonderful job, she says herself. And I just couldn't see where I might go. And I remember talking to the CEO about it when I was leaving. And he said to me, just don't run before you can walk. And I came out of that thinking, I'm just going to fly and I'm just going to see what happens. And it was a real moment for me of not people trying to hold you back. That wasn't his intention, but I really wanted to go out there and see what was going on and what I could do. And I wanted to try things without worrying if I might fail. You know, if I did, that was okay. I'd find something else. But I felt ready to go and do something else. And actually a role came up, again, not very far away, to work in an agency. And I was going in as their business development manager. So it was an internal communications agency. So I was starting to put my marketing degree to use and my knowledge of internal communication. But doing a stint in an agency was one of the best things for my career because it meant that I was completely immersed in this world of internal communication that I didn't really know existed, had an idea from that phone call from Melkram, but I didn't really know what was out there. And working at this agency for a year or so meant that I was suddenly going to events and networking, and I was on Twitter talking to people and doing all of these things that I had never expected to be doing. And it gave me such an insight into what was possible. It's where I wrote my first white paper looking at social media channels inside organizations. It was a paper called Collaboration in Action, and I wrote it in partnership with a guy called Kevin McDougall, who I'm still in touch with. And it's amazing to me to look back and think, oh, that was the first time we really started to think about how social media is playing a role and what that might look like. So that was great fun, but I missed the buzz of being in an organization. So I missed seeing things through to finish. As business development manager, you're going in, having conversations, winning the work, and then it goes over to someone else. And I missed being a communication professional, I think. So I did about a year or so there, and then I got a role in London as internal communications manager in the travel hospitality sector. And I talk a lot about my career here because this was my first role as a manager. Again, I was setting up the function from scratch, so there was nobody there before me. And I spent about 6 years here, 6 or 7 years, and I became global head of communications by the end. I was internal communications manager for the UK, and I left as global or group head of communications. And this for me was where my career really took shape. I was having to communicate with a lot of frontline and deskless workers, so that is what probably created my need to do the research and really get into that to try and find out about it. But this is also where I was told things like, your opinion is not enough in the boardroom. And that's what made me go and do my diploma in internal communication. So I had that academic backing behind me for what I was doing. It was also where I joined the Chartered Institute of Public Relations, and I'll talk about them a bit more. And I volunteered for them on their internal communication committee. And I did more research work with that. And I did a lot of work with CIPR over the years, becoming their president in 2020. But this for me was where I really found my footing. And I think I really found that ability to learn as I was doing the job. I was setting up another function. There were challenges within that around how to get budget. How do you do a business case for that? How do you navigate your way through an organization going through a lot of change? Having the courage to go for that global head of comms role when my experience in media relations and external communications had been quite some years ago. So this was quite a big piece for me because it's where I started to really find my voice in internal communication and find what I was really passionate about. And I think for our role, which I always say internal communication is a vocation, it's not a job, because I think we care so much about what we're doing, that being able to learn and grow in here doing professional development was huge. And so I left there as global head of communications. And I remember even on my last day, marking up the corporate brochure and the global CEO coming out and saying, Jenny, isn't it your last day? And I was like, yes, but I just need to get this done because I just need to make sure I'm leaving everything how it should be. And it was one of the best jobs of my career. It was it was a real mix of fun and challenging. There were so many times in there where I cried, where I laughed, all sorts of things, but it's the growth for me. And I know that about myself, that that's what I'm looking for. And that role grew from internal communications manager in the UK. And then I built a team, I had a couple of people in the team there. Then it became global or group head of internal communications. And then it became global head of communications. So it was a gradual shift. And the growth was more in the team and the budget and different things until it became looking after the whole world, which was good. And then that took me to my final in-house role, which was communications director in the pharmaceutical sector. So you see, all of my sectors have been completely different, but I've also moved sideways a lot. You'll see as I've gone through those 6 roles, they're not necessarily going up all the time. So from business development manager to internal communications manager, still the same industry of internal communication, but I wasn't necessarily going up. It was very much sideways. And going from global head of communications to communications director is almost essentially sideways as well. Again, this was setting up a function. It was going through a merger and acquisition, and they needed somebody that could set that up and look at the culture and change and all those sorts of things. I didn't know anything about the pharmaceutical sector at all, but it was a role that came up and I was headhunted for, and it was an opportunity that I couldn't really turn down. So I went over there and did a year with them until we realized that really they wanted probably a head of communications or a manager role, not a director role. And so we reshaped the role. I helped recruit for it. And then I left and set up Redefining Communications as a consultancy from there. And that was 7 years ago that I set up Redefining Communications. And that's kind of the journey as it is. Since being out on my own, I've done all sorts of things, but I want to keep this focused on that in-house movement, because sometimes it's really easy to think that we can just go for the next thing. But the theme across all of these 6 for me was my curiosity and the questioning and the growth that I was looking for along all of those. If you're not prepared to learn and develop and grow, then it's really difficult to move forwards. People are always looking for you to be able to show your capability. And I think if you want to grow and move roles and go up an organization, you have to show that that capability is improving. And if you're not doing that, then it becomes very difficult for people to see how you are any different from that role if you want to go into that role. So it's just making sure that you're really showing that. So essentially, what I've tried to cover there is that you don't have to stay in one space. And if you do start quite broad, then you can really narrow that. So I started broad, then I went media relations, then I went, oh no, not for me, coming to internal comms. And then I stayed in that. And then when I got this opportunity to go for that global head of communications, I actually had a call with my mentor, who I hadn't spoken to for quite some time. But I wanted to talk about, do I stay in internal comms and look for director of internal comms roles, or do I broaden out and take it all? And that, through that conversation, helped me see that actually I wanted to have more breadth, and I didn't want to be so narrow at a senior level that I was just too narrow for what was maybe out there. So that's why I decided to go broad. I've talked about moving sideways. I've talked about the mentor. Keep looking outside. I can't share that enough. Making sure that you're networking and going to events, attending things like this, talking to people is huge. Because when you're working with leaders, or you're trying to influence, or you're trying to do your strategy, or all of those things, it takes more than you to do that. And sometimes you don't have a team. A lot of internal communication professionals work on their own. And then, so having that outside network is so important, because it really gives you that ability to learn, and it gives you a real support network. I've met some of my best friends through networking groups, which I never expected, but it's allowed me to form friendships, to learn, to really challenge myself. And it's meant that when people challenge some of my thinking, like your opinion's not enough in the boardroom, I can come back with, well, actually, I've been to this event, or I've heard this, or I've got this, and I've got other people with me. And that makes me feel better and more capable, because it's not just my word shouting into a tunnel. There's other people with me in doing that. And the last point on here is about figuring out what you need or want from your work. So I talked about the fact that I didn't feel very fulfilled doing some of the media relations stuff. And I spoke to someone the other day and they were like, oh, I love the media relations. I love dealing with the press. And at the time I really did, but it just wasn't enough for me to get that sense of purpose. And that's obviously something that's deeply ingrained in me in terms of helping organizations communicate better, because I do believe that can change the world of work. All of our problems are interpersonal relationship problems. So if we can solve that in the workplace, it can make it just such a better place. So that for me was what I needed. I needed to feel that real sense of purpose and achievement, and being able to see that in the people that I work with and the impact that that has. Now, I've talked a bit about the importance of networking, but I wanted to list out just a couple of places, because it's easy to talk about, you need to go networking and you need to go to these things, but it's also helpful to know what's out there. So there's the Chartered Institute of Public Relations. Now, as a conflict of interest, or as a caveat, I've already shared that I was a volunteer with them. I was their president in 2020, and I was a board director for them for a few years as well. Now, when people ask me who they should join, I will recommend CIPR if they are looking for a broad set of communication skills, because you can join different specialist groups within that. Hugely helpful if you're looking at upskilling some of the broader areas of communication. Then we've got IABC, which is the International Association of Business Communicators, predominantly in the US and Canada and Australia. They also have a chapter, as they call it, or a group in the UK. But it's much more US and Canada based. Their annual conference is always US or Canada, and it's definitely more over there. But I've been a member with them for a few years. I'm not going to be a member next year, just because I haven't been using it, and it's important to me that whatever I'm investing in, I am using. But I've been to their World Conference. It's very good. So if you're over in the US or in a more international, then very good. CIPR is also international, but I know IABC has a good program of development and good resources and good local groups all over the place. We've got the Institute of Internal Communication, who are very UK based. I don't know if they're international because I'm not a member with them, but if you're very much specialising in internal communication, check them out and see what they're doing. They do a festival in the UK, they have a magazine and other bits and pieces, so worth a look. And then I've popped on Ecology, which is set up by a couple of people in the US. It's a little bit different to some of the more traditional chartered or institutes that I've listed here, but it has a very active community in their membership. I often get pinged alerts from the app of people having conversations, and they do a lot of events as well, but also more US based, but they are worth checking out. I'm sure there are others, but as I was preparing for this today, these were the 4 that came up for me. And really, it's the opportunity to connect with other practitioners and talk about what you're doing and meet people so that you can share that, you can talk about it, and you can learn, because the whole way you're going to advance your career is learning. If you don't want to learn and you don't want to find out more, then it's going to be really hard to get that growth. But all of these networks could include someone that could be your mentor, could include someone that might give you a job, could include someone that could become your best friend. There's so many different things that they will benefit you on. And if it is a vocation, like I said, it feels for me, then these will be hugely helpful places to help you network through that. Now, the other question I get asked a lot is, how do I know what to learn or what to focus on? Because there's so much out there. There's so many books, there's so many podcasts, there's so many masterclasses and conferences and events. How do I know which things to go to? Because we've only got so much money and so much time. So how do I make sure that that's going in the right places? And so for me, there are 3 things to consider. One is the foundations. So communication is very broad. Even internal communication as a specialism is very broad. Being able to define it is difficult. And whilst there are definitions, I have one, Dr. Kevin Ruck has one, there's various ones out there. it's still a very broad discipline. So you have to focus on the foundation in terms of those core skills. So if it is internal communication, which for a lot of you being here, it will be, it might be employee experience or employee engagement, then we have to get the foundations of those in place. And that might be some of the academic stuff, but it might also be looking at things like, how do I do a strategy? Like, that's a foundational piece. It was a masterclass Workvivo and I did. I think it was our first one that we did, which you can watch back, but it's looking at those foundational pieces and getting that right. So if you haven't got that, then those are the things to start with. A diploma might be too much for people, but there are books, mentoring, coaching. It's that practical stuff. So you've got to try it, see how it works, but it's getting those foundations in place. So spend your time on those rather than maybe some of the shiny stuff that's often talked about that won't help you in the long run in terms of that strategic advisor or that strategic role that you might be looking for. We have to know our weaknesses. You know, I reworded this slide so many times of know your opportunities, and then I just stuck with weaknesses because it's easier to make sense of. I know what my weaknesses are, and they are opportunities, but I know when I was starting to look at my skills and development, research and data was something I didn't feel I was that strong at. And so when I thought, okay, I need to develop that, what can I do to develop it? Oh, I'll do a research project with a data scientist because he's really skilled in this. I can learn from him and I can increase my skills at the same time while doing something that I really care about. And that was where the research came from into deskless and frontline workers back in 2019, was because I identified this as something I needed to develop. And I've gone on to do 3 or 4 different research projects since then. So I'm quite comfortable looking at where my gaps are. And you can use different competency frameworks if you want to use them as a baseline. The Institute of Internal Communication has one. I think there's a few others out there. There's definitely one from CIPR. But even if it's just things like, you know, listening, data, creativity, writing, you can use the top 10 skills that came from VMA Group, a recruitment consultancy, in their research for next year. I've blogged about that, so I can ping that out to people if you need it. But it's using something as your baseline to go, okay, what do I need to work on here? And being quite real about that. Okay, we all have stuff we need to develop and work on, because as much as we might like to think we're good at all of it, there's definitely a few things in there that we will need to tweak. And then the final thing is to make a plan. So when I became a chartered practitioner, part of that exercise and part of that assessment is to create a 2-year continuous professional development plan. And whilst I don't have a 2-year plan all the time, when I did this years ago, it allowed me to look far enough forward. You know, we live in a world that is very instant, very quick, with a lot of false urgency, that we want to be able to do everything now. But actually, it takes time to learn and develop and advance your career. My career from communications assistant to communications director was 10 years. And I'm not saying it would take 10 years today, but that wasn't a bad time. You know, in that time, I did so much around mergers and acquisitions, organizational change, ownership of organizations changing, you know, different industries. I was able to give myself that space and time. You don't need to rush to get there. And actually, when it comes to your development, having a plan that's a year or 2 years means you're really looking more deeply into the subject. So for me at the moment, if I look at my plan, this year I've been doing some work on becoming a wellbeing coach. I've got to do my assignment this week. I must get it done. Because that was something I needed to develop in terms of part of my coaching practice and helping people with their overall well-being. Next year, I might look a bit more at psychology, and I'm starting to look a bit more at that. But also last year, I was looking at leadership and all of the insights I was getting around that linked to the book. So everything had a reason for why I was doing it, but it was long term. So you want to have something that's maybe a year or 2 years and go deep into the stuff that you really want to learn, rather than just thinking, oh, I'll listen to that podcast and then I'll know the answer. True development has a practical element, and it has to be a bit more deeper than that and a bit more time spent on it to really be able to advance and move that forward. I have put a note on here about not having more than 3 things in a year. And this is because we can overload ourselves with goals, and it is the season it is the season of goal setting and thinking about next year. And I'd hate for somebody to leave this and think, oh, I need to come up with all these things I want to do next year. There are other things in your life that you'll want to be doing. There's other things I want to do and learn that are not linked to work at all. So give yourself space. So having kind of 3 things that you might want to develop is absolutely fine. I wouldn't have any more than that. And you don't have to have 3, you might just have 1. But this is again why we spread it out. So we don't want to feel like we have to do it all super quick, because there is time. Even though we might not feel like there is time, and it's important to make that time count. Now, I've got a few questions that you submitted in advance, so I'm going to answer those quickly, and then we'll go into the questions. I'll stop sharing my screen, and then I'll be able to see the questions that you're asking as I'm going. So if you haven't asked a question yet, then please do put it in the Q&A, and I'll get to those in a second. They can be as specific as you like. I am here for you, so whatever you want to ask is absolutely fine. Right, here's one of the questions we had. What specific advice would you have for a late career professional who came into the communications field late? So this is a question that I think comes up every now and then. So people move careers all the time. There's some lovely statistics about celebrities who have started their career in their kind of 50s and 60s. And I think that shouldn't stop you. I think my specific advice is to always be curious. For me, that advice doesn't necessarily link to that late career element. I think we should always be curious. I think there will be things in your past career, whether they are obvious or not, that really play a role in communication. So it's finding those and bringing those forward. I wouldn't disregard them, because I am sure there will be things there that will help with communication. I would do some of that foundational work. So I would go and have a look at maybe some of the academic stuff, or some of the more academic books that have been written on internal communication, so that the reasons why we do stuff make sense, because that might not have come up for you if you're coming in a little bit later, because that might be something that you think, oh, I've kind of missed my chance to do that. But those foundations are really important, and it stops you being second guessed. And if you're coming in a bit later, that experience that people might be looking for in the profession won't be there. So we have to kind of combat that capability question with that knowledge. So we have to make sure that's really, really clear, and we're doing the work to demonstrate that. But that goes for everybody, really. I think you just probably have to dial it up a bit more if you're coming in a little bit later. The next question is, what would be your best advice for someone who is new to internal comms, and any book recommendations? Of course, I've got a book recommendation. So my best advice would be that if you're new to internal comms, connect with people on LinkedIn who work in internal comms, whether it's consultants, whether it's in-house people. Then take the time to connect and do a little note that says, I've just joined the profession and I just want to follow you just to see your content, just so I can learn as I'm starting my profession. There are other groups that are free. So there's a Facebook group, which is Internal Communication Professionals. There's other LinkedIn groups. And I'm in the Facebook one, and there's quite a nice little chat in there of people just asking questions. And it's a lot of people that are new. So it's finding some of those places to ask questions. One of the things I've often done when I have started a role, or if I've got a new CEO or a new leader coming in, is I've gone and found the person that they worked with before. So when I worked at that travel hospitality company, we had a new CEO come in, and he came from organization X. And so I reached out to the internal communications manager there and said, look, you used to work with this person. He's just joining us. I'd really love to have coffee just to know how he works, and what does he think of internal comms, and they were great. We had coffee, and I found out he was wonderful, which was wonderful. And so I'd always advocate doing that, because it just helps you get to know more about that person or that industry. When you're new to internal comms, if you're in a sector, find people in your sector and ask them if you can jump on a quick call, or can you go for coffee? The internal comms world is quite small, and it's quite nice. People are quite happy to have coffees and chats and jump on a quick Zoom call if they've got 5 minutes. It's just having the courage to ask, and you will find that there are some people that won't, but the majority of people definitely will. Book recommendations, really great one here. really great one there, which is influential internal communication. Now, the only reason I do recommend that is not just because it's mine, but because I wrote it based on what has been in my head for 20 years and based on lots of books that I'd read, where I felt that if somebody just read a little bit of that book and a little bit of that book and a little bit of that book, then they'd be able to get a better understanding of internal communication. So the book talks about neuroscience and understanding people. It talks about leadership. It talks about organizations, all sorts of things. So that one I would, of course, recommend. There are others. So there's a book by Joanna Parsons, which is Innovative Internal Communication, that came out this year. There's another book by Rachel Miller, which is Internal Communication Strategy. There's some books by Amanda Coleman on crisis communication. There is a book by Advita Patel and Priya Bates on inclusive cultures. So if you want generic, I can give you some books for that. But if you want to read more or learn more about specific elements of internal comms, like crisis or culture and inclusion, then there's some specifics on that. But I've got all of that on that PDF of all the books I've read in about the last 5 years. So if you'd like it, drop me a DM on LinkedIn and I'll ping it over to you because we've just updated it. The next one is, how do you know when it's time to move on, not in, from your current role? Now, this is totally down to you, and it's totally down to your situation and the environment and the market and all of those things. So I only moved when I realized I wasn't learning anything else. And internal comms can become quite cyclical because you might have the same stuff each year. And sometimes there's different ways of doing stuff, and that makes it different. But for me, it was, I don't feel like I've got any more learning to do here or any more growth. So I'm going to go and find somewhere else where I can learn and grow. That is completely related to my values and what motivates me. For some people, they might not want to move on. They might really love the company, the role, and you don't have to. If you're really enjoying your job and you enjoy your life and things are very content, then don't feel the pressure to move on and do something just because, society might say you have to, right? You don't. It's all of our lives are different. We're all individual. What motivates us, what moves us is always different. And there's something, I remember someone saying to me, a lady who worked for me, and she said, I don't want your job. I never want your job. I love what I do. I love writing. I love creating content, and I'm going to be doing this forever. And she's still doing it in different companies, but she's still doing that creation of content because she loves it. And I think that's what you have to figure out, is what's the stuff that you really love, and are you doing that in your current role? And what is it that you need to feel fulfilled? And if that's growth and things like that, then how do you find that? How do you get that? But only you really know the answer to that, which is a massive cop out on the question. But we have to know. We have to know what it is that we're looking for. I always say to people when they're thinking of getting a mentor or a coach, like, what does success look like for you? And I think your career can be treated in the same way. What would success look like for you? If you were to leave, what are you looking for? What does that look like? And then does leaving help you achieve that? Or do you need to do something different in your current role? And that's a really important sort of mindset shift to think about, because otherwise you could move and go on to something else without really knowing whether or not that's the right move, because you haven't really said what that kind of success criteria is. And that's quite important for us as well. Now, I mentioned before I stop sharing my slides, I mentioned that you can win the book. So both books actually this time. So if you tag me and Workvivo by Zoom, you have to tag both of us in a post that you create on LinkedIn with the one tip that you've taken away from today. And then we'll do a draw of all those names. And then I'll pop two of those books, or one of each of those books, in the post signed for you as well. So thank you for doing that. I'm always excited by the prize draw. And now I can go into Q&A, which is also my favourite bit. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides and I'm going to open up the Q&A and just see what we've got in here. Oh, I always enjoy it when people answer other people's questions. It always brings me such joy. Right, let's start with Kelly. She has said, a lot of organisations now are looking for communication professionals that cover internal, external, events and marketing. Oh, they want the unicorns. What advice, I'm just going to have some water. What advice would you have on being able to do it all when your career has heavily focused on one particular area. Now, Andrew Thomas has put a response in there saying similar for them. They're looking for a new role. Found a lot of people asking for proven change or transformation, and he hasn't covered that. So this is always very interesting. So I think if people are looking for something very, very broad, I would question whether it's the right role for you to go for, because we can't really be all things to all people. My first role was all of these things. I was doing events, I was doing internal, external, and marketing, but it was a broad role. So it depends what the role kind of title is. If it's a sort of communication manager role, sort of fairly generic, then I would expect it to kind of do a little bit of everything. But that means that you can build those skills. So this is skills based, and you can build skills. So if you have got really strong knowledge of internal communications and events, then you can learn the skills on external and marketing, but it also depends on what percentage of role that is. So I'd be asking, what's that split in terms of all of it, in terms of percentage? And is, what's the opportunity for development where we might be stronger in some and not others? I don't think that's an unfair question in a kind of interview or a process or anything like that, because it's really important to be open and have that conversation. But these are skills we can learn. And I think it's important to remember that context. Just to bring in Andrew's point on there around people asking for transformation and change. I remember early on in my career seeing roles that had exactly the same. You've got to, what's your change experience and all this. And there's a lot of talk about change communication and business as usual communication and how different or the same they are. And I don't think at that time in my career, I remember thinking, I haven't done any change. Like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what I've done in order to kind of articulate that. And then if I thought about it, there was probably a good 3 or 4 examples where I was communicating something because something needed to be done differently or things were changing. And it doesn't have to be a big change and transformation project, but being able to communicate change, I think all of us will have done in some way. It might not have been a massive project, but really think about where you've had to do that and come back to some of those change models around what do you want people to think, how do you want them to feel, and what do you want them to do? And there's also things like the 6 concerns of change and the COM-B model. Now, I'm not doing a change session today, but there are certain models you can draw on and talk about that you'll probably find as you think about them that you've kind of done them and you have asked these questions and you've communicated some change projects. It might just be a bit of a reframe. If you haven't, then that's part of your learning. We talked about the fact that we've got to have those foundations and around that intentionality of your time of what do I need to learn, then change would be a great one. The book Neuroscience for Organizational Change by Hilary Scarlett was one of those books that I read and thought, if people read a bit of this, it would help. But that's a really great book for understanding why we need to communicate during change. And it takes away the opinion because it's based on neuroscience. So it's a much better conversation. But there's other change resources out there. There's webinars, there's courses. I think if you feel like that's an area for you that you don't have skills in, then use this time to learn around that, podcast, books, events, whatever you can do that's appropriate. And you'll probably find from doing that, okay, I've done this or I've done that. I guarantee you, if you've worked in comms, you will have done some element of change. I would almost bet my hat on it. Nearly said my house, but we're not feeling that confident today. Hat is fine. So hopefully that helps. We've got another question in here, which is your best advice to someone that is starting as internal communication manager in a new firm and building everything from scratch? Lauren has then commented on that saying, echo this, I'm just about to join a company as an internal comms manager setting up from scratch. What would be your recommendation? So my first recommendation is to watch the masterclass that I did on internal comms strategy, because that talks about setting up your strategy and the 3 components that you need for it. Setting up from scratch is such a gift, okay? Because everything you do is better than what has ever gone before you. So always remember that. It's always an improvement, even though you might not feel like that. So everything's going to be better. The first thing I would say is use your first 3 months wisely. You have to ask a lot of questions. You have an absolutely brilliant window of being able to ask everything and anything because you're new. This is a new function. I've got to ask all the questions of everybody and gather everything. You have to really listen during this time. They will want some quick wins. So they will want some sort of channel put in place. They will want something quick. So figure out what that might be. It could just be an email newsletter that goes out on a Thursday. Fine. Could just be a quick summary of what's happened in the last week. Could be a letter from the CEO. It doesn't need to be anything fancy, but they will want something quick that will start to create some sense of communication if there's nothing there. But you need to look at what's existing at the moment. So what are the channels that they are using, because they will be using stuff, and then talk to people, do a survey, do some focus groups, find out what people like about how communication is, what they don't like, and speak to the leaders to understand what their challenges are. If you're brand new, somebody has put a business case in for that role to exist. Why? Leaders are not going to spend money on something unless there is a problem that it solves. So what's the problem that you have been brought in to solve? And if you can get the answer to that, it will help you frame your strategy and your work around that. And that is the gold, because then you're aligned to exactly what they want you to do. But don't rush to do anything concrete. So that's why I say about the email newsletter, you can turn that off. As you evolve, that might become something different. So it's more about, we're going to start something, we're going to do it for a few months, and then we're going to evolve it and change it. The other thing you might want to do is put your arms around everything. So sometimes when there isn't an internal comms person, there might be Slack, which might be chaos, which it seems to be in most places. And so if they have got something like Slack where there's lots of channels and you might want to just sort of turn the taps off a little bit and put your arms around things. I used to do it before things like Slack existed, and there'd be sort of the all-person email, and everybody could send to all-person emails, and it was terrifying. So one of my first things was turning all of that off, so everything had to come through one place. And that wasn't because I was, power happy. It was because I wanted to make sure that we had a funnel so we could understand the volume of content, and then we could sort of start to figure out what to do with that. But I couldn't fix stuff that I couldn't see. So that's why I started to do some of that stuff. I hope that helps. Right, let me keep scrolling down. Next one is, how do you find a good mentor? Do you have any recommendations? So a very personal thing, a mentor. So my first mentor was Sheila Parry, who was my boss when I was in the agency, and she stayed with me as a mentor for a few years after that as well. And just because I felt very comfortable with her, her knowledge was huge. And I really respected and valued her opinion. And that for me is what I'm looking for in a mentor. It's a mentor in comms. So I wanted someone who had that knowledge and that ability to help me. But you've got to find someone that you like. So I mentor and coach people. I know that Rachel Miller does. I think Joanna Parsons does as well. Like, there's a few of us out there. Advita Patel does. There's quite a few different people that do. So it's kind of going out and finding them. Anyone that's doing mentoring and coaching should offer you a conversation at no charge, even if it's sort of 20 minutes, just as a bit of what I'd call like a chemistry session, for you to get a bit of a sense of whether or not this is the right person for you. And it's completely personal. So that would be my advice. And if you want me to introduce you to anybody, or you want to have a chat about it, then just let me know on LinkedIn or drop me an email. That's absolutely fine. Right, let me see where I am. Right, we've got a question here. What advice would you give to a person who is looking to shift career into internal communications? Would you recommend a course or do more practical work while in a current role? Same for me. I would probably be doing a course while staying in my current role, or trying to get a secondment shadowing opportunity into that function if it exists. I think it's all about the learning, and it's understanding the difference between what your current role is and what internal communication is. So it depends what your current role is, in order to know kind of what's the best thing to do. But if there is that desire to go into internal communications, I would look at going to events. I would look at spending time with the internal communications lead in the organization. And I would probably invest in sort of books and things. I wouldn't do a course like a diploma or something yet. It's a big investment. And as much as I'm a huge supporter of them, I've taught on the diploma for a number of years of internal comms, and they're fantastic. But I think you've got to really make sure it's the right thing. And if you want to shift, there's other ways of investing in your learning that might not be such an investment of your time and money, because it's a good kind of 6 months. So we've got to make sure it's the right path. But I think you can network, get to events, in-person events, and learn about what it is in internal comms. And getting to big events is the best way to go. So some big conferences and things like that, depending on where you are in the world, but get to something face to face, invest that time and money in going to the event, because I think that will give you the chance to meet people, give you the chance to see what it's all about. And I think that will give you the biggest return on an investment in terms of what you would get from that, in terms of knowledge and testing that it really is where you kind of want to go. Right, what else have we got? I love doing the do when it comes to internal comms, and I don't really want to distance myself from that. Oh, I've been there by going down a leadership or management career route. Is there a progression route you would recommend outside of the leadership route that still keeps you close to doing the do? And then there's a little chat between some people in there saying, hello, lovely. So I've always been a doing the do. I do less doing. How many times can I say do? This is fun. I do less doing now as a consultant, but I still do get involved in communication audits and stuff like that. I don't do as much writing now as I probably used to do, but I'll still get involved in focus groups and interviews and stuff like that, because I quite like still getting my hands dirty. For me, I think you can still do the do even if you go up, because it doesn't mean that you're managing people. So in my career, I've managed probably 1 or 2 people in the teams that I've had, but I've always had an outsource model. So I've always had an agency for trade press, an agency for financial press, some content writers, some designers. I've never had a massive team, because it wasn't a model that I wanted, because I wanted to do the do. So I think if you are wanting to go up, I think you can go up without having to have team management. If you are starting from a place of, I'm doing this current role on my own, and this current role needs to grow in terms of strategic influence, right? That's basically what I've done. So I've grown it in that I'm now doing the strategy. So I do need to bring in someone to do maybe the operational side, and then I've outsourced the rest. So you don't have to have a whole big team. You can still stay doing stuff. I think if you want to completely stay in the doing and the content, then I suppose my sort of question back is, what is it that you're looking for from a career perspective? So if you want to keep doing the do and doing maybe content or write or whatever it might be in there, where do you want your career to go? So is it, as I said about the person that used to work for me, who was like, I don't want to do leadership, I just want to do really good content and copy. They were really happy there. So I suppose it depends on what progression looks like to you in that role and defining what that means. Because if it's just salary based, like I just want to earn more money, then there has to be a shift in that role, either in kind of responsibility or strategic element or management. So it's kind of figuring out what progression means to you. Very happy to pick that up offline if you want to drop me a DM and ask me anything specific, because we can voice note on there and talk to each other. And that might just be a bit easier. But I think it's being very clear about what's the progress you're looking to see, and then kind of coming back from there. Right, I have got 5 minutes left. And quite a few more questions in here. Let me keep going. What would you say is the difference between employee engagement and employee experience? Employee experience encompasses the relationships, it encompasses the tools and the processes and the environment for the employee, and it maps to the employee life cycle, whereas employee engagement is an outcome or an output of good experience and good communication. There we go. I answered that a lot quicker than I thought I was going to when it popped up. Right, let's keep going. What else have we got? Thanks for the session, Jenny. Really interesting to hear your journey. I'm wondering what's the biggest thing you think helped advance your career, in particular, going from assistant executive to manager, and what advice would you give to someone looking to establish themselves without necessarily getting a degree? So, I mean, I wouldn't have got a degree had I not had to. But I mean, I'm glad I've got it, but it was only because I was made to do it. I think the thing that advanced my career the most was the learning, really, was that I was very keen to learn how I could be better and very keen to learn how I could make communication better. And so I was always listening to the leaders around me. When you sort of think back to your career, and I think back to that being an internal communications officer, my memory of that is spending a lot of time with the CEO, with the director of marketing, with other directors, and I felt like I was probably annoying them all the time. But it was that was hugely helpful in terms of having their time and understanding what they needed communication to do. The other thing I did in that officer role was we had a fantastic learning and development team in-house, and I ended up doing some work on what would almost be the equivalent of DISC. So understanding how I worked, how my manager worked, and had a bit of sort of coaching around how to adapt my style to different people to make them more comfortable. That was huge, because once I could stop walking around holding my notebook up here and talking really, really quickly because I had so much to get done, and I moved my notebook down and I would talk slower, opened up the ability for me to build better relationships. So I think probably a roundabout way of saying the things that probably advanced it the most was learning my own style and learning other people's style and how to connect better in doing that. And also asking a lot of questions and being really inquisitive with leaders to understand how I could make things better. I definitely have a live to serve mentality. I always want to be helpful. And the more helpful I am, I think the better I feel. So I think that's a big part of, I always say to people, always be helpful. Like, even if you can't do it, suggest someone else. Because I think that really warms people to you. And I think that's really important when you're trying to build relationships, which ultimately we are. Right, let me see if I can get one more in. I've got 2 minutes. Let's see what else I've got in here. If I haven't answered it, I will grab these and then I'll see if I can find you and answer them. How do you think the market looks like for an IC professional next year? I'm actively looking for a change, and best tips on cracking interviews, something that I find very challenging because of the tough job market. So I did a post on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago after I saw a panel of recruitment experts talking about the market, and they had some really good advice. But those recruitment experts were Crystal Pierce from VMA Group, Vicky Marenka, who is a career coach, Andrew Holland, who runs Comms Leaders, and Andy McLeod, who also is involved and works at, don't know what his title is, at Comma Partners. And the 4 of them did a fantastic panel with advice for people looking for jobs. I would recommend talking to them because they are in the thick of it, and they know a lot more. But there was some good advice around not using the quick apply button on LinkedIn, making sure you're tailoring your CV and doing a cover letter all the time, and finding the comms people that do work there and kind of contacting them and being a bit disruptive in the process to make yourself stand out a bit. But the don't use quick apply was a very firm, don't do that, because I think that's just getting lost and noisy. Right, I am at time, and I do like to keep to time because it is our biggest commodity. So all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you for joining me. As I've said before, please do the post on LinkedIn tagging both me and Workvivo, and we'll put you into the prize draw. Huge thanks to the Workvivo from Zoom team for having me for the final masterclass of this year. I am back next year, and we'll be announcing some more details on that in the coming weeks and months. But I will be back with some more masterclasses for you. But huge thank you for being with me. It's always a pleasure. I will get back to the people that I haven't got back to. And thank you so much. Have a lovely afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.